I can see how English-speaking liberals fooled themselves. I think they literally fooled themselves because they wanted to believe this was all going to turn out wonderfully. That it was all going to turn out okay once you got rid of apartheid. We'd all learn to live together, kumbaya, blah, blah, blah. Now, that was just naive. I think the Americans were naive. But the question is, why? I still ask myself, why did the National Party just fall over like that? I mean, could they not see that this was going to become a disaster? The Buddha walked away. It just walked away.
My guest is Professor Eric Lowe. He's a retired professor in political communications with a career spanning South African and Australian universities. Prior to that, he was a former activist, a journalist, and a media trainer under the African National Congress. We worked on South Africa's transition into the post-apartheid era. Eric Lowe is an expert on affirmative action. I'd like to know what that is, Eric. And an expert on Black economic empowerment policies. His PhD was in the study of Marxism and its postmodern developments. He has authored 9 books, including The Rise, Fall, and Legacy of Apartheid and the Media and Political Process. Also, one that particularly got my attention, Afrikaner Identity, from anti-colonial struggle through hegemonic nationalism to disempowered minority. I'd like to get into that. During the 80s, you were a member of the UDF, so in fact, a member of the African National Congress, one would say, and you helped to set up structures for the ANC guys that returned back from exile. So let's start there. Before we get to that part of your activity for the African National Congress, your involvement of the African National Congress, Eric, just give me something of a background about yourself. I heard, because I've listened to some of the podcasts, that you're from a family that arrived in South Africa, I think, back in the, 1700s or something like that?
Yeah.
Sketch me the background.
1658, I think it was, Yep.
Yeah.
So it goes back a long time, and then they trekked up to the Free State and the old Transvaal. After the Boer War, they got back to their farms and there was nothing left. And so they said they'd heard there was this new country called Rhodesia, which was being created. And for a whole bunch of reasons, thought that would be better. Let's start again afresh. And so they trekked up to Rhodesia.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, well, my mother's side was even earlier. They were pioneer column people. So they went up in the 1890s. My father's family went up just after the Boer War. So they were in Rhodesia for a long time as well.
Yeah.
And then after school, I went to university in South Africa. After university, I got called up to the South African Army, spent 2 years there. While I was there, I actually started studying at UNISA part-time while in the army because I was so bored. And I ended up getting eventually when I did a PhD, I was offered a job at university, and so I became an academic.
Tell me a little bit about your evolution into the world of politics. How did you end up at the end of the day as a member of the United Democratic Front, which was basically the internal wing of the African National Congress? What year was that, by the way, as well?
86, I suppose, 86, 87, around the 87, I think it was. Yeah. 87. Okay. So, well, I always was interested in politics. My father was interested in politics. He in Rhodesia, he was part of what was called the Dominion Party, which then became the Rhodesia Front. So he knew all the Rhodesian Front dudes. And so he was always interested in politics, and you pick this up from your parents. But as a teenager, I suppose I've always been, what should I say, a rebellious type. when I come across somebody saying something, I never believe them. I always go, if you're saying that, I'm going to go and see what the opposite dudes say, and then work it out for myself. That's just the nature of who I am.
Yep.
Right up until today, I always do that. I don't believe the first thing I read about something. So, okay, my parents were very conservative Rhodesian front people. But as a teenager, it all started actually by accident. I discovered I loved reading. Like I used to read books all the time, and I discovered this great little bookshop at the Anglican Cathedral in Salisbury, which they kept all the books that other bookshops didn't keep. The ones that they were the naughty books that Ian Smith didn't like. Okay, because the church tends to do things like that. And I was fascinated by this, and I started consuming these books and reading them. You see. Anyway, the woman who ran the bookshop, she was a Fabian, and she watched me and she watched what I was reading. It says a great deal about how the left go about recruiting people. I learned it in a personal way, how they do this.
Yeah, I have to interrupt you here just for one moment, just to help me. I think quite a few other people out as well. What is a Fabian?
Okay, the Fabians are a fascinating group of people in Britain. The Fabians are Marxists who they broke away from the regular Marxist party, if you like. So they were left-wing people, but they said, we don't need a revolution for this. Let's not fight. Let's not have a revolution. Let's do this democratically. And the Fabians said the way we spread this lefty stuff is we sell the idea, we market the idea, we put it out there, we find young people, we go into the schools, we go into the universities. It's they were quite happy to do this over 50 years, slowly, systematically teaching people to see this other way of seeing the world, okay? And they've been tremendously successful. I mean, truly, they are unbelievably successful at this. In many ways, they produced, the Labour Party grew out of them in Britain. They produced all those socialists in Britain.
And you then, Eric, is this before you went to university or as
yes,
your university career?
Yep. So I'm still at school. I'm at school at this stage.
Yeah, and you are now fully Fabian.
Well, it was iterative. It wasn't really what happened. This woman who was running the bookshop, she was a migrant from Britain and had been a Fabian there. And she noticed what I was reading. And of course, she's a Fabian. So she takes an interest in me. Okay. And she says, I've got some stuff I think you'd like to read.
Yeah.
And she said, wouldn't you like to sign up to the Fabian newsletter? And you get all these free books sent to you and all these free, all this wonderful free stuff to read. And I thought, that sounds great. I like reading things. And if it's free, I like it even more.
Yeah.
So I signed up. She signed me up, and the next thing I was being posted all this stuff from London by the Fabians, and I was consuming this. And it's designed to influence young people. I mean, that's what they do.
Yeah.
And it certainly worked with me. All right.
And is it Eric? Just for clarity, sorry that if I'm interrupting, I just want to get clarity on this. The Fabian ideals. How would you describe that? Is it simple, straightforward socialism, communism?
Yes, it's socialism.
What socialism?
It's okay. The communists don't really like them because they don't believe in revolution, and they're reformed Marxists, right? They believe in doing it peacefully, using the democratic system, getting elected into parliament, but doing it slowly over a long period of time. So they're not really Marxists, but underpinning it, they're socialists and believe in all that stuff. So that's the message they're selling. Okay. So clearly, I was influenced by this. I was a teenager, and as a teenager, what do you know? I mean, I don't have a great deal of knowledge about the world.
Well, plus also, Eric, I can imagine as a teenager, the ideas of equality for all, we are all the same, etc., is also just simply very appealing for a young person.
Of course it is. You haven't experienced life, and you haven't thought about all the problems with this. And it sounds, well, it's humanitarian. It's great. I mean, let's love and kiss and cuddle up to everyone. I mean, that's what it says. Sounds great. Okay. Anyway, I obviously then didn't agree with my family. So I changed I was unlike any of my family in my political views. But my father was I think my father was a great guy. I mean, really, he was a tremendous guy. And his attitude in life was, you have to work out your own life. I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong. And I think one day you'll come to recognize that.
Yeah.
But I am not going to tell you what you have to believe. You believe, you work it out for yourself. I'll discuss this with you anytime you want, but I will never tell you you're wrong, and I'll never tell you you can't do these things. I mean, he's a great guy, as I say. I think that was tremendous. I do the same with my kids. It's like, your life is yours. You believe what you want. All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he never stopped me from this. He just went, yeah, didn't like it, but let it run. So by the time I got to university, I was already a socialist. Okay. But I wouldn't say I was a very sophisticated socialist. It was just the kind of stuff that the Fabians had obviously got me in their manner of thinking. Okay. But obviously, therefore, I was ready for the next stage. And when you go to university, what happens? Well, you get more of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so clearly, that's how I ended up becoming left wing.
Just give me an idea once again. Which university was this in South Africa?
Oh, believe it or not, it was actually Tukkies.
Tukkies.
It was actually Tukkies.
So you became a socialist in Tukkies.
I became well. It was interesting because again, there weren't very many of us, I have to say, but we found each other.
Yeah.
Look, what happened is that obviously my family in South Africa had been Afrikaans. All right. Yeah. Well, my father's family were Afrikaans. But in Rhodesia, everybody spoke English.
Yeah.
And so by the time you get to, I was the third generation. By the time you get to the third generation, you speak English.
Yeah.
But I decided I was going to go and live in South Africa because I just liked it. I really loved South Africa. And I found Rhodesia was too rural for me. I just thought, no, this is not where I want to be.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, if I'm going to live in South Africa, I need to learn Afrikaans. And so I thought, well, I'm a pretty lazy guy. I'm not going to sit down and learn. It's just not how I learn. I think I have to throw myself in at the deep end and see what happens. So that's what I did. I went to Tukkies and went, well, I just sink or swim. And so that's how I ended up at Tukkies.
Yeah.
And as I say, okay, so it wasn't as if Tukkies was full of socialists, but as I say, there were more than you might think, and they all found each other. Okay. But I wasn't an activist then. I was just interested in this stuff and read more and more of it. And then I got called up into the army. And again, there it was quite interesting because, again, the socialists found each other. I was in DHQ, and there was a Marxist reading group at DHQ, believe it or not, okay, of conscripts, because conscripts, we found each other there again, see?
Yeah.
But I still wasn't an activist. I wasn't politically engaged. I was just interested in the ideas, if you like.
Yeah.
I become an academic. It was when I moved to Natal University that I became an activist, because most of Natal were left wing. I wasn't one of a few isolated people. It was the dominant culture at the university, so it was obviously very easy to be a socialist then. And indeed, one was rewarded for being a socialist in that situation. And at that point, of course, I also then met UDF people. There were lots of UDF people. COSATU, of course, was born in Durban. COSATU started as a University of Natal student project. And I, of course, therefore met all these people who'd created COSATU. So I just met all these people. They were all over the place, and I got to meet them. And because they were activists, I just became an activist. And so that's when I got involved in the UDF as an activist.
Yeah. Tell me about when it was time for the exiles to return. I read somewhere, or I heard on the podcast, you then became involved in setting up kind of like the committees to help assist the process of reassimilating these people back into South Africa. So you were then really, I would imagine, quite deeply structurally involved.
I was a trusted comrade, shall we say. One of the things that I did, which I suppose they liked the best about all work I did, I worked in many different committees, but I helped set up something called the Durban Media Trainers Group. And what the Durban Media Trainers Group is that we trained ANC and COSATU media workers. They didn't have these people. We taught them how to be journalists. We taught them how to be public relations people. We taught them how to sell the idea, how to go out in the township and get an idea out there. I mean, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Because there were not a lot of black people that knew how to do that stuff. And we ran a fairly large operation training. We trained thousands of people, literally, over the years. Many of them eventually ended up at the SABC replacing people like you. What can I say?
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah. Well, okay. Then, as you say, what happened is when the ANC was unbanned, I mean, the ANC did not really have structures in the country. They'd be decimated, absolutely decimated. And because at that point, there was also a huge debate within the UDF as to what do we do now?
Yeah.
And it was a close call thing. I mean, many people in the UDF did not want to fold themselves into the ANC because they were not like the ANC. They really weren't. I mean, the UDF was a much more, it was a group that had liberals in it. It had Marxists, it had social democrats, it had lots of different kind of people. And it wasn't as radical as the ANC. It didn't have the same black nationalist stuff. So it was a different organization, okay? The ANC just said, fold yourself into us, you're us, okay? And there was a huge argument in every single UDF committee. There was debate about this. And then there was a vote in every committee is, do we join the ANC or do we set ourselves up as a separate party to fight them in the next elections? Because we aren't really like them. And in fact, in the committee that I was in, it was as close as one vote. And that was pretty universal. It was really, really close. It could just as easily have gone the other way. So anyway, we did fold ourselves into the ANC at that point.
Let me ask you just about that, Eric. What was that like when the first Exiles came back? And there were some pretty big names that then came back into South Africa. Did they kind of immediately take over the structures of the UDF? Were they the big men that you kind of bowed down to, that you had huge admiration for? Because here they all are. Suddenly Mandela is freed and Mbeki returns. All the big names are beginning to move back into the country. Tell me a little bit about what was that like then. Was it then, I guess what I'm getting to is, did they overpower and take over and suddenly you had to submit to their ideals?
Okay, yes and no. Like it was a little bit like this. I mean, there was a huge change, and I didn't like the change. I mean, I left the ANC quite quickly. But okay, if we look at what happened is, in terms of the big guys, all right, they came into the country and they would do tours of the country. They whipped around the whole country, meeting everybody who had been an activist and was important in the structures. So for example, within the first week of Zuma coming back, because he came back to Durban, of course. And so we were told there's a meeting, he's over there, we can go meet him. And so we all had a meeting with him and he kind of introduced himself and said hello. But of course, yes, what they were saying is we're back. And yes, they sort of expected you to understand that they were the leaders. Okay. I'm not saying, not that every UDF activist went along with that, but yes, that's what happened. In fact, I remember when I met Zuma, when I went into the room, didn't know anything about this dude, and he scared the hell out of me. He really did. That was the impression I had of him when I left. I thought, you don't want to get on the wrong side of this guy. This is a very heavy guy. This guy will hurt people. He will really hurt people badly. That was my impression. Like I want to stay as far away from him as I can. The same with Mbeki. He did the same tour. He went around, had a meeting, same kind of thing. Sat down with everybody, and they presented how they saw things unfolding, explained the problems. We don't have these structures. You guys are needed to help us because you understand what's on the ground, etc., etc. So that was the one.
And the process, Eric, was then, in fact, the African National Congress, now no longer in exile. They came and they vacuum sucked you all up into the institution. That's exactly right. That's what happened. I wrote a note here. I listened to some of the podcasts you've done. You said in some podcasts they brought back with them Stalinism and Africa Uhuru nationalism.
Yeah, so
unrepentant.
that was the change. Okay, but that change wasn't even so much the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if okay, I thought Mbeki was a fairly reasonable, smart kind of guy. He didn't strike me as a hardcore ideologue who was going to do crazy things. But yeah, so it wasn't like they were all like that. But it was the rank and file members that scared me. So the UDF had always been. I mean, the UDF genuinely believed in non-racialism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was mostly because the UDF was created by coloreds and Indians overwhelmingly.
Alan Bushak was one of the major players.
Absolutely, but it was coloreds and Indians, and it really was an organization of minorities who realized, in some sense, that the minorities, exactly what we've seen happen in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
You're not actually black, and there's this black thing going on, and you realize it's there. And in many ways, the UDF, although it was an ANC, it was ANC. Okay, the UDF saw itself, or I think most of the people in the UDF, or many of the people in the UDF, saw themselves as a counterweight to something that was called the Maluti group inside the ANC. Now, the Maluti group was Winnie Mandela and that bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And they were black. They were hardcore black nationalists, and they didn't like white guys, and that was unambiguous. And the Maluti group had the numbers, and the people in the UDF kind of saw themselves as a counterweight to the Maluti group. It was the non-black nationalists. It was the minorities saying, "Hey, we are as well." Okay, so and that was always there. Now, so the UDF always functioned, I think, quite differently to the ANC. But of course, we didn't understand that being inside the country because we didn't know what they were doing out there. When they suddenly started to come back, the change was dramatic. I mean, so all right, I was the person, I was put onto the interim committee in Durban to create the structures in Durban so that all the exiles coming back to Durban would have a home, and then they'd be sorted out, and some of them might need money or whatever it was. Okay. And when this happened, as these guys came, the change was radical. It was radical and quick. It happened over about, I would say, over a year. It was really quite instantaneous, because suddenly the committees, which used to be multiracial, turned black. And they turned black because you had all these guys coming back from Africa. The guys coming back from Africa had this black Uhuru stuff. They were still living in the 1960s.
Yeah.
They literally were living in the 1960s. And then the guys coming back from Eastern Europe, well, because they were traumatized, because they had many of them had been in East Berlin. They'd seen the wall come down. And they were committed Stalinists. They could not believe this had happened. But they brought this with them. They brought this angst with them. So you saw this change to the organization. And the other thing that happened is, as it changed, whites, coloreds, and Indians left. They didn't say anything. I remember meeting someone 3-4 years. In fact, I met him in Amsterdam, funnily enough. I was at a conference in Amsterdam with someone who was from the Eastern Cape, but he'd been at the same kind of thing. He'd been an activist in the Eastern Cape. And I met him at this conference in Amsterdam, and we sort of got talking. And eventually, I said to him, I don't do this ANC thing anymore. I left. I just walked away. And he said, strange to say that. I did the same thing. This is a white guy, all right? And he said, I did exactly the same thing. And I said, why? And he said, I just felt really uncomfortable. I just felt really uncomfortable with that stuff. And he said, I went home to my garden because my plants made more sense to me. And I said, it's funny you should say that. That's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that happening. So you got change from two things. You got the white, colored, and Indian activists withdrew because they just felt uncomfortable. They didn't say anything. Didn't say anything to anybody else. Just didn't go back to meetings.
Yeah.
At the same time, all these other guys were coming, and so very quickly, it just changed. The whole nature of the thing changed.
Yeah. What was it about the political character of the African National Congress that drew you in? What was the political ideals, the dreams, the vision that was attracted that attracted you in the first place? And then I just want to talk about this idea of, as you call it, the unrepentant Stalinism, the Uhuru nationalism that you encountered when you actually met these guys for the first time. Because as you met them there in Durban, a lot of them traveled around the world with their message, and we met them here in Europe. And what we saw here in Europe was the face of highly sophisticated people that seemed to speak the language of the ideals of multiculturalism, obviously, but also the ideals of the modern liberal democratic order. So there seems to be a little bit of a dichotomy there for me, or a sort of a clash in ideas there in terms of the way in which they represented them to you back in South Africa and to what we saw here in Europe.
Yeah, look, and I think they didn't just do it in Europe. I think they also did it to white liberals in South Africa. They were also, I mean, Van Zyl Slabbert toward the end of his life said they fooled me. He actually said that. I only now do I realize they were lying to us.
Yeah.
Okay. So okay. But I think that was in many ways deliberate. The smart guys, the guys at the top, understood that perfectly well. They knew they had to present themselves as liberals, and so that's what they did, because they knew that their audience were the Americans. They had to persuade the Americans that all we want is a liberal democratic state, so support us. And of course, they were incredibly successful. That is exactly what the Americans thought of them. I'm not sure that they convinced all the Europeans. I think Europeans are a little bit more sophisticated than Americans, and some of them could at least see through it. But the Americans just bought that stuff whole as bolus. So the question was what? How did I see the change come about, or why did I do it? Is that what you say?
Yeah.
Okay, I got involved. I guess I got involved because I didn't think apartheid was going to work at that stage. To be honest, I also I don't think I actually fully understood apartheid. Only when I got to Australia, Australians kept asking me, what is this thing? And I decided I had to go and do some research to find out what was this thing. And I was on holiday back in South Africa. And I actually spent time at Stellenbosch University. And the thing that taught me about what apartheid actually was when I went to the social work department at Stellenbosch University, where Verwoerd had been. And Verwoerd had put together a conference, a social work conference in Kimberley. And that would have been, I think, in the 1930s, something like that. And at that, because he saw the poor white problem. And as a social worker, he was interested in how do we fix this? And he put together the social work conference in Kimberley. And it's where apartheid was invented. That was at that conference, because he said, we have to take control of the state and solve this problem. And everything grew out of that conference. Now, I went into the social work department at Stellenbosch and said, do you have anything here? Well, I went to the library first, and they said, no, they haven't got anything. And I said, okay. So I went to the social work department and said, do you guys got anything? And they said, yeah, there's a box in the storeroom. There's this box there. No one ever looks at it. Would you like to look at it? And I said, yeah, bring it out. And I was amazed. I just sat for hours and hours and read through all his notes. And he'd made all these notes. And it was all the stuff from this conference. And as I read it, I came to understand what the actual idea of apartheid was, what the intellectuals thought they were doing. And it wasn't necessarily what I thought they were doing.
Yeah.
Because what they said didn't look like what I saw in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, I want to unpack that. I think that's a very important thing that you're touching on right now. I think there is this really superficial idea that apartheid was created by a bunch of bad guys back in 48. The image of the cruel Afrikaner was pinned around that idea. And of course, that is really all nonsense. I listened to some of the podcasts in which you explain how apartheid really started. So
Mhm.
I really want to unpack this because it's a fascinating story. And I think we ought to then go back to the creation of the Union of South Africa, the British that wanted to have a system of segregation, your definition of what that segregation meant, the ideas of what the Brits wanted is bringing in lots of cheap labor into the country and segregating people. The idea, as I understand it from you, is we work together, but we sleep in different places, to put it
Yeah,
in
yeah,
superficial
yeah,
terms, and the creation of horizontal separation, I
yeah,
think, talk about,
yeah.
versus the ideas of apartheid, which more moved in the direction of what one could call a vertical
Vertical.
separation. Unpack all of that for me, because that really tells me, for the first time, also the
Yep.
real story of apartheid.
Yeah. So okay. Okay. It starts with the social worker Verwoerd and the early, and that's also the Dominees. I mean, people like Milan was a Dominee. So the Dominees saw this poverty all the time. The social workers saw the poverty all the time. And of course, they blamed the British and said the British have done this. So that was what they were trying to fix. Like, how do we save the folk who are being impoverished in this way? So that's the baseline of what they're trying to do. But then Verwoerd is the guy who translate that into a political project. And he looks around and he goes, and Werner Eiselen as well. I think Werner Eiselen is, everybody overlooks him now, but he was the key intellectual. He was a very smart guy. And Verwoerd and Werner Eiselen invent this political project of apartheid. Okay, so they are dealing with the British. They look at what the British have done. And of course, what the Brits are on about, and it's not just in South Africa, the British do this throughout their empire. Because what an empire does is it throws races together. Per definition, that's what it does. But the British, although they've brought everybody together and they make them all work together in the empire for the sake of the economy, they don't really want to mix with these guys. They're not the same. So they create a system whereby the British can run their empire and the British can maintain their own little cultural space. So the British continue to live in their suburbs and their cantons and whatever it is, and they remain British. And the people who they've colonized are elsewhere, and they get segregated into separate social spaces. So you work together in the day in the same economy, but at night you go and live in separate worlds. That's segregation. Segregation it's partition, but it's only partial partition. It's not full partition because the British don't want you to be fully parted. They want you to work together during the day, you see. Okay. Now, apartheid
is it not also important here to mention the fact that it's also here about cheap labor? It's
absolutely
about how the money system.
Absolutely. So, well, in South Africa, it's certainly so. It was different in different parts of the empire.
So you
but
need the cheap labor. You bring the cheap
Yeah.
labor in
Yeah.
from all over the
Well,
place.
okay. If you look at, I mean, Cecil Rhodes is the guy who invents the economic system in South Africa. So he looks at South Africa has a particular problem. So the problem is the wealth that's going to make the place flourish is mining. It's minerals.
Yeah.
It's a dry place. You can't. It's not going to flourish on agriculture. It's going to flourish on mining. But the problem that in South Africa is that the minerals are deep, really, really, especially the gold. It's unbelievably deep. That's unusual. We don't realize that. We just think everything is like that in the world. But that's a South African geological problem. Now, because the gold is so deep, you've got to dig unbelievable holes to get it out. You need a lot of technology. And the capital costs of just digging the hole to get to the gold is fantastic. Now, in a place like Australia, you could not make South African gold mines work. They would be uneconomical. You couldn't make them work because the labor is too expensive. So Rhodes looks at this and he goes, the only way we can make this work is we've got all these black guys. He looks at Africa and he says, hey, what's the one thing we got here? We've got lots of black guys. And these guys are very exploitable. They allow themselves to be exploited. So hell, let's do it. Let's just bring these dudes in and turn them into cheap labor units. And of course, that was the model that Rhodes invents.
Yeah.
And the whole of Southern Africa eventually is based on that model. And now the next thing is South Africa is dry. I mean, it's like Australia. There's not a lot of people. Both Australia and South Africa are relatively empty spaces in population terms. So when you want all this labor, they're not there. And so that's exactly what the Brits do. Not only do they set up this mining industry, deep level mining based on cheap black labor, now they've got to find the cheap black labor. So what do? They go and they recruit it in Mozambique and in Zambia and in Malawi and in Zimbabwe and other places, because that's where the labor is. And they bring all this labor into South Africa. Now, that was the point at which, Verwoerd realized that. And Verwoerd said, and a lot of these intellectuals, there was about 10 of them that sat down and said, this is going to destroy the Afrikaner folk. We are going to get done in by this, because these Brits are just going to keep bringing in this labor, millions of these guys, and we will become this irrelevant little minority. We'll just disappear in this demographic shift that they're causing. So we can't allow this to happen. So that's what the National Party, that's what the Milan's National Party were trying to do throughout the 1930s. They were trying to explain to Afrikaner voters, vote for us because the Brits are going to do you guys in. And of course they couldn't. They didn't actually work. These guys carried on voting for Hertzog. They carried on voting for Smuts. They didn't change over to the National Party. And the change came about when people could actually see with their own eyes that something had happened. And of course, it happens in the Second World War in a sort of accident. Okay, the Germans are bombing the British cities. The British can't produce their weapons in British factories anymore, because they're getting bombed every night. And so what the Brits do is they relocate their weapons manufacturing business to Canada and Australia and South Africa. They made the weapons there, far away from the Germans. And that was the point at which South Africa became industrialized. It was about weapons production initially. And of course, this happens at exactly the moment when the South African white working class are being sent into North Africa to fight against Rommel. So you're getting rid of your white working class at the very moment when you need lots of workers. And Smuts' response was, throw the doors open. Just throw the doors open and let all these black guys pour in. And they did. They poured into the cities. I mean, that's when Mandela came. That's when he moved to Johannesburg. All these guys moved to Johannesburg then. And of course, when all these guys came back from North Africa, what did they see? Their cities literally looked different. They'd left. So black people had always lived in the rural areas, in the homelands, not in the cities. Now they get back and these guys are all in the cities. The cities look different. And the National Party turned around and said, you see, we always told you this. We always told you this. Vote for us, or we'll send them back to where they came from. And that's effectively the political project of apartheid.
Yeah. The point I'd also like to make, Eric, and I also got it from listening to your podcast, was the forces at play post the creation of the Union of South Africa was the idea of the Brits to, well, also assimilate the Afrikaner. The Afrikaner had to become English. That was part of the project. The other part of the project was we need cheap labor. To be able to exploit the gold riches of South Africa. So your business model is dependent on that cheap labor, and it is also dependent on keeping that labor cheap. In other words, you're not going to do anything in terms of development of these people. You got to keep them literally down as well, and that's where the idea that came from.
The British, for example, British never built schools for black people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the great ironies. Everybody goes on about how Afrikaners were terrible because, you know, they were racist and all that. But it was Afrikaner. It was the National Party that built the schools for black people. The British never built schools for black people. The only schooling you got if you were a black guy under the British is you had to go to a missionary school. The missionaries taught some black people, but that was it. Very few. So that's one of the Anglicization thing, of course, was it's quite interesting how we ended up in South Africa with two very different kinds of nationalism, both of them born from what the British did. If you look at the British thing, the way they treated Afrikaners and the way they treated blacks, very different.
Yeah.
And that's why we have these two different nationalisms. So the British wanted to assimilate all Afrikaners because they basically said, hey, look, dudes, we're all basically Germanic. We all come from the same German tribes originally. So let's just all be the same. Let's come back into the fold.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is speak English and you'll just be like us then. So they wanted to assimilate Afrikaners into the British tribe. Blacks, those black guys that went off to the mission stations and got educated. And those were the families like them, like the Mandela family, the Mbeki family. The guys that became the ANC leaders were exactly the people that went to the missions and got westernized and learned English.
Yeah.
And because what they then wanted to be assimilated into this British world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what the British said, no, we don't want you. So there was the irony. The British wanted Afrikaners, and Afrikaners ended up saying, bugger off, we don't want to be English. We don't want to be assimilated. Go away. Leave me alone. And that produces a nationalism that is about retaining your own identity, your own language, etc., etc. Whereas black nationalism in South Africa was born out of these mission black guys who were liberals. They were literally English liberals. They regarded themselves as English because the missionaries had taught them to be British. And they thought they were British. And now the British won't let them in. And there's this tremendous shock. Like, why won't you let us in? Why are you putting us at arm's length? Why are you segregating us away? And if you listen to the ANC's rhetoric, it's all about that. So the early ANC, the ANC in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, are actually very moderate. They're liberals. They're liberal black guys saying, let us in. We want to be with you. And it's only in the 1940s when radical blacks, and that's like the Mandelas and the Tambos and the Limbedi was a big one. There was a couple of them. They come along and they say, hey, no, bugger these guys. They're just shitty. They don't let us in. They're horrible to us. We must go to war now. And everything changes. And that the ANC then becomes a radical organization.
Yeah.
So there's two different kind of nationalisms.
Yeah. Well, as an Afrikaner, I'm an Afrikaner. So what I obviously like to put the focus on here for myself and for my own people, because we carry the brunt of it. We're the guys that get bigger. You are the creators of apartheid. Is just the simple concept of the difference in approach from the British side, who created a system of segregation, which, as you define as work together but sleep apart. They create the idea of horizontal separation, which creates a class system. I could imagine. I think you even use in one of your podcasts, you use the word, that's what white supremacy is all about.
I think that white supremacy is what the British did.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm arguing here right now, and that goes against the grain of Afrikaners who, defined by Christianity and their profound belief, turned around. I'm using your words here, Eric, and said, "But this is not fair towards the black." So we envision rather a system of horizontal separation where every tribe, they're not even calling them tribes anymore, they call them nations now. Every nation has a right to come into his own full bloom. There's a saying here in Holland, elke mens naar zijn eigen waarde, each man to his own value, which is what that sounds like. Idea that
it's Verzeelen. It's actually Verzeelen. I mean, there's no mistake that apartheid is basically the Dutch model of Verzeelen taken into South Africa. It's a pluralist idea. It's like we separate. We're not the same. So give everybody their own independent space.
So and the philosophy behind that is the idea of each separate group will emancipate itself from within its own character and its own culture. That's the idea of verzuiling as it was applied in Holland.
So this is why the National Party looked at what the British were doing and said, this is patronizing. You're patronizing these people. You're treating them badly. You are the racists. We don't want to be racists. We don't dislike black people. We just not like them. We want them to have their own countries like we want our own countries. So we will create these separate countries. We'll create a separate country for the Zulus and a separate country for the Xhosa, etc., etc. And of course they said, once that is done, we won't have to suppress them anymore. We don't want to suppress them, and that'll be great. We won't do it. In fact, we can then help them develop their countries. That's a very different model. But now, of course, I think English-speaking South Africans who are liberal never understood that. They could not get their heads around what the National Party was saying. They kept saying, "This is what you're doing is segregation." And I had this all the time when I would say to English-speaking South Africans, and I'd also say to liberals in America or in Australia or in Britain, say, no, apartheid was not segregation. You guys did segregation. These guys did something completely different. They were doing full partition, give the guys their independence. And of course, okay, the beauty for Afrikaners is that if you did manage to give all these guys independence, then eventually there will be very few black people who are citizens of South Africa. So Afrikaners will be the demographic majority, and hence they'll have their own country.
Inside their own country. Well, and that's in fact, Eric, if I understand you're correct, and once again I go back to, I refer to one of the podcasts I've listened to, is what the Afrikaners then actually said is that we are going to smash down this whole union of South Africa, which is an artificial construct. We're going to break that up, and it will be broken up in all these different states, and all of these different states will be move towards own government, and we will then find ways of cooperating in, I would imagine, what would be a confederation or something to that ilk, which in a lot of ways is in fact quite a progressive ideal.
It is indeed. It's well, I mean, when I look back on it now, I think that is more democratic, and I also think that, well, I think we would have avoided all the catastrophe that we've seen in South Africa if that model had been implemented.
Yeah.
It just makes more sense. Okay, now earlier on you said, why did I go to the ANC? Okay, now part of the reason is that in the 1970s and the 1980s, apartheid, I think apartheid was a smart idea that was poorly implemented, if that makes any sense. It was executed very badly. And I thought about this a lot. And I've come to the conclusion that the defining moment in South African history was Verwoerd's assassination. I really think that. Because Verwoerd was a Harakat guy. I mean, he really was Harakat. And he knew this had to be done. And he said, this is going to happen. Verwoerd understood that to actually unscramble the egg, to break up the British-made state into 11 separate states, is going to inflict huge amounts of pain on people. And it's not just going to inflict pain on black people. It's going to inflict pain on white people. To do it properly, everybody's going to suffer because you're pulling it apart and you are disrupting it. A little bit like what Trump is doing now. It's very disruptive. And disruption, people don't like disruption.
Yeah.
Verwoerd said, there will be disruption, but there's no other way we can save ourselves. So we're going to do it. I'm just going to do this. And because he was a Harakat guy, I think he would have pushed it through no matter what. When he was assassinated, we ended up with Foster. And if you look at Foster, he just wasn't that kind of guy. Foster was a guy who liked to negotiate and do deals and be reasonable and go, can I compromise on this? And he made lots of compromises. So, for example, when English businessmen went to Foster and said, dude, what are you doing? You're wrecking the economy. Why would you do this? He went, yeah, that sort of makes sense. Okay, well, how can I make an adaptation here? And so if you look at Werner Eestelin's model, one of the key things that Werner Eestelin said is that he wanted to start the homelands. They start them as small the original reserves that the British create. So that's the beginning of the model, not the end of the model. And you send black people into those reserves, but then you've got to give them skills. You've got to train them up. They've got to learn how to run a state. And as they learn, this is the important part that Werner Eiselen said, as they learn to do it, so you expand the homeland states. Because he said you have to make them viable economically. There's no point making some funny little state that's never going, everybody can say, but that's not a proper state. And if you look at what he was writing about, Eiselen argued you basically have to give the whole of the Northern Transvaal to black people. You'd have to give the whole of Natal, the whole of the Eastern Cape, just give it away. Okay. He was talking about seriously giving away land to black people. And of course, Verwoerd's argument was, yeah, well, we have to do that because what we get to keep is good. That's ours. But we have to make lots of sacrifices. And yes, we have to give some of the best agricultural land in the country to black people to make this viable so that it can work. And he was going to do that. Foster didn't do that. He pulled back from doing that. He never actually implemented apartheid. And by the time you get to the 1980s, I mean, I think that's what P.W. Botha realizes. He goes, we missed the boat, dudes. We had a time when we could have, there was a time when we had the power to just do it. Nobody could have stopped us. We just could have pushed it through. But we didn't do it when we had the opportunity. Now it's too late. We can't do it. We got Americans breathing down our necks. Black guys are mobilized now. We buggered. We can't do it now. Now, I suppose in a sense that's what I was seeing. But I saw that before I understood what Eiselen was trying to do. All I saw was that in the 1970s and 1980s, the National Party was saying they wanted to do this, but I couldn't see them do it.
Yeah.
And I'm going, but you're not creating a proper viable state here. You're kidding yourselves. If you're going to do it, do it. But that's not what I'm seeing. So you must be lying to me. Okay. So that's the reason why I thought, well, if this is not working, we better come up with something else. There better be some other model, which I then tried and decided it was even worse. Okay.
Yeah, but the other model is, of course, the direct inverse of what
exactly
was. So now it is okay, abandon all of that.
Exactly.
Just very briefly, what were the most important things that worked against the apartheid ideal, and to what extent did it fail because of the international community that would not?
Yep. Oh, look, I think that at the end of the day, the Americans stopped. The Americans got the government they wanted in South Africa, unambiguously. They forced that, at the negotiations, they forced that settlement in the way it was. And by the way, I think that's one of the mistakes that Afrikaners made. Afrikaners always, I'm not saying that the Soviet Union was not a problem. Of course, the Soviet Union was a problem. But Afrikaners thought that was the only problem, that the communists were the bad guys. And of course, the communists were the bad guys because they were funding terrorism. We understand that. But in many ways, I think the more dangerous people for the apartheid idea and for Afrikaners were the English liberals, particularly the liberals in America. They were the bad guys. They really were bad guys. They just really disliked apartheid. And by the way, I think they disliked Afrikaners too. I mean, they developed the most appalling ideas. I mean, when I migrated to Australia, I would hear things that just horrified me at what they actually thought. I mean, it was just wrong in every respect. So, yeah, the international community played a huge part. And at the end of the day, I think Afrikaners were so busy focusing on the communistische gevaar that they didn't notice that Washington was just as much of a problem, if not more of a problem. And that's where you had to deal with that problem. And they never did. They were focusing in the wrong place. And then one day, whack, they got clobbered from behind and it was all too late.
Yeah.
So, I think the international community played a huge part. But let me add to that. I also think that English-speaking South Africans played a huge role in this. And the reason is, and I look, half my family are English-speaking South Africans and half my family are Afrikaners. So I hear the difference all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And English-speaking South Africans now are going, whoops, whoopsies, because they were telling stories to their cousins in Britain and America and Canada and Australia that weren't even true. I mean, some of the ones, there was one book which I think was tremendously influential in this regard. It's called The Rise of the South African Reich, written by a South African Communist Party member, an English-speaking guy who lived most of his life in London. That was a tremendously influential book. That was completely untrue. If you look at it, it's just absolute garbage. But of course they believed it, because you're inclined to believe your own cousins. I mean, it's as simple as that. And if your cousins say, these are bad racist guys,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
believe them. And of course, here's the other thing. English-speaking South Africans were building the system based on cheap black labor. And they were the businessmen. They wanted this money thing. They wanted the machine to carry on generating money for them. And Afrikaners were threatening that. Afrikaners wanted to take that all away from them. If you actually implemented apartheid, English-speaking South African businessmen would be done in. Their whole model would be destroyed. Now, they weren't going to go to their cousins in Australia and in Britain and in America and say, these Afrikaners are taking away our money by wanting to destroy this. They wouldn't do that. They were much smarter than that. What did they say? They said, these are racists. These are Nazis. They're bad people. And of course, their cousins believed them. And that left an incredible legacy in that way. But as I say, I probably didn't realize that until moving to Australia, when I heard what the effect was here, and realized how powerful that was.
Yeah. I must say, I encountered the distaste, the hate for the Afrikaner, also only when I actually moved to Europe for the first time. And I'd experienced it so many times that I would be thrown out of studios and things like that. I was just the hateful, racist Afrikaner. Nobody could see beyond that. It was just a Nazi emblem. It was just painted on me. I want to take a little bit of a big jump now. Because we're going to run out of time. Finally, apartheid collapsed. The apartheid government said themselves, we cannot sustain that. International pressure, international sanctions. The mood is not internationally is not favoring the ideals of whatever the ideals might have been of the fathers of apartheid. And we started the process of renegotiating our future. Here is my next question, and it's a question that I've asked many, many, many times, and it remains unanswered to me, and I think you might shed some light on it. The way I formulate the question, Eric, is always, what happened to a liberation movement that was created back in 1910, at the time of the falling of apartheid, an 80-year-old liberation movement that was hugely well regarded internationally, who fought for the liberation of their people, a la the Freedom Charter and the ideals of the land shall belong to all people. What happened to that organization when they got to the CODESA talks? And it will appear that within a very short period, they sold out all those ideals that they fought for 40 years for a bag of money. That's the statement I'm throwing out. Am I correct? And I hear this, and I've spoken to a lot of people within the African National Congress. I've spoken to people that were very close to CODESA that had, in many, many, many words, told me bluntly that the African National Congress was bought by white money. Tell me the story.
Yes, I think the role played by the Brenthurst Group is enormous. And that's the thing I was talking about earlier, because I think what one saw at CODESA was that the Americans, by the way, the Americans took over the South African problem as they saw it from the British when Thatcher went. that was also a major turning point. The Americans, the way they ran the Pax Americana is that they used to farm out different bits of the world to different countries to deal with those problems for them. And the Americans had basically given Southern Africa to to the British. So you guys understand these people, you deal with them for us. And Thatcher, of course, was not a crazy. She understood South Africa quite well. And so while Thatcher was running the foreign affairs, for the whole Western world towards South Africa got a better deal. But apparently what happened was when she was knocked out as prime minister, the British decided we want to wash our hands of this now. It's all too hard. It's all unpleasant. And they gave it back to the Americans. So that happened, in fact, in 1990. And that changed. That's that foreign affairs bit that we were talking about earlier. Okay. Now, the Americans then come on board with a whole new different model. And it's the one we've been talking about. The Americans, they do have this vision of Afrikaners as a bunch of nasty Nazis. And they want to change it radically. Now, Mandela is the saint. We want to just crown him as the president as quickly as we can. So that changes what the Americans want. The Americans are now working with the liberals in South Africa. That's their cousins. So they are working with, at that stage, the Democratic Party, and they're working with the Brenthurst Group. So the Brenthurst Group brings together all the rich kind of business guys. And the model that the Brenthurst Group developed was, when they realized, oh my God, these commies are going to take over the country. The Boer are actually going to lose control. The commies are going to take over. Then suddenly the Boer didn't look so bad anymore. And they went, oh, this is going to be very bad. How do we stop these commies from taking everything from us? And the Brenthurst Group came up with the model that if you want to change a communist into a capitalist, you make them rich. And so that's what the Brenthurst model was. All these rich guys they cut off a certain part of their wealth, put it in a separate fund, and they created this Brenthurst fund, which would then hand out the goodies, hand out large amounts of money to ANC politicians to turn them into capitalists by making them rich. And they literally did that. A whole bunch of them were bought off like that. Now, you see, for me, that's bad enough that a whole bunch of them were prepared to do that. But it's the worst thing for me is that it produced a bizarre ideology inside the ANC. Remember, the ANC have got this communist thing. And what does communism say? It says black people are repressed by white people. White capitalists repress black workers. That's their basic fundamental model. Therefore, rich capitalists are bad people. Rich white black capitalists are bad people. All right. They don't believe whites worked for what we got. I mean, that's part of the ANC belief, which they still have. It's like they stole the land. They exploited us. We did the work. They took the money. I mean, that's the communist idea. The communist idea is that capitalists don't work for what they have. They just steal our money and our wealth. And in South Africa, white people steal our money and our wealth. Now, when the Brenthurst Group go and hand out the goodies like this, can you see that ironically they confirmed that ideology? They just proved it to them. Because suddenly all these commies went, oh, we always knew it was like this. We always knew that you didn't have to work for it. You just took it. And that was proved to them because it worked in their own personal lives. So it became and then of course the next thing that the Brenthurst Group offered was affirmative action. We will give you guys affirmative action. We'll lift you all up.
Black economic empowerment.
Exactly. And that's giving out the money. Because it's affirmative action is an American idea based on liberal guilt. So the liberals have this guilt about, oh my God, what have we done? Oh, well, we can rectify it by handing out money. Again, what does that do? It actually, for a communist, it proves they were right. That you don't have to work for it. And so it produced within the ANC a confirmation of the worst aspects of their ideology. So the cadres come back with this idea about they stole the land, they stole the wealth. And now they get told, yeah, we can have affirmative action. We can just raise you all up. What that, of course, produces, well, we now can see, we know it produces a particular kind of corruption. But it's a corruption that they don't see as corruption because they believe that's what whites did. They're just doing the same thing. In fact, because I saw that very quickly. That's one of the things I saw. By 1993, I realized what was going to happen. I could just see, I thought, this is going to become a disaster because it's going to produce corruption and maladministration. They're going to break the country really, really badly. It might take 20 years for it to happen, but they will destroy everything. And I said that to them. I was saying inside ANC, this is a bad idea. Don't do this. It's going to turn out very badly. And in fact, I remember on one occasion saying that at a meeting. And one guy, one of the cadres in Durban said to me, he said, Eric, I don't understand you. You've been with us all these years. You've gone through all this shit with us. And now when it comes time that we're going to be rewarded and get the money, you walk away? Are you crazy? And I said, mark my words, you are going to break the country. Mark my words, this is going to happen. Don't do this. And funny enough,
are we saying, Eric, and I suggested this to you as well in our pre-discussion a little bit, that in very vulgar terms, in very straightforward terms, it literally is buying the belief system of the African National Congress through their buying their negotiators, putting shares in companies in their pockets, giving them money in their pockets. But let me just is that not the seed that you sow for the corruption that will later then become South Africa?
That is part of the story. Okay, I think the person who at the end of the day drove the change over that transformation period, the key thinker behind all this was actually Mbeki. Mbeki was the guy who decided, okay, from an ANC point of view, you could say he sold out. All right. Now, Mbeki didn't become rich. He didn't take their money. It wasn't that corruption thing. Mbeki did something else. What Mbeki did is, I mean, he's an intellectual guy. He sat back, he looked at this, he realized that one of the things, of course, that changed is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans now literally own the world. They are the only power. They can do anything they want, and they can tell everybody how it's going to work. And they do. I mean, the American hubris is fantastic. They go around from 1990 onwards doing exactly what they did in South Africa, saying, you are going to be democratic because we're going to make you democratic because we're smart and we know what's good for you. Now, the Americans did that everywhere. Mbeki realizes that's going to happen. He realizes the Americans now have the power. He realizes, because Mbeki's a communist. He's also a member of the Communist Party. And he goes, guys, we can't do this communist thing anymore. They're not going to allow it. The Americans are never, never going to allow us to do this. We're done. So if we can't have for the first prize, let's take the second prize.
Take the money.
Let's take the money. And the second prize is, we're going to create a black middle class because, of course, liberals in South Africa want a black middle class. The Americans want a black middle class. The Europeans want a black middle class. And in fact, the National Party also bought into that by then. De Klerk bought into the idea of let's have a black middle class. So the message being sent to the ANC is, we want you all to become a black middle class. So for the ANC leaders, it's like, okay, well, that's fair enough. I'll become quite well off. Why not? It's my turn to eat now, is basically the argument, right? But in addition, they did go a bit beyond that, and they said, we will let you run an affirmative action program to raise up a whole bunch more of your people. Okay, we've seen them do that. Okay, so not every black guy comes off out of this very well. In fact, most of them come out of it very badly. But you do create 10 million black people are raised up, and so Mbeki goes, well, 10 million. Okay, I would rather have 60 million, but it's not going to happen. Let's take the 10 million. Let's take prize number 2. Now, not everybody buying into that, I think, was corrupt. I don't think Mbeki was actually corrupt. He stuck by his principles, and many of them did, but a hell of a lot didn't. most of them were quite happy to turn into Gucci comrades and just become rich. But they could rationalize it away. I mean, they literally could rationalize it away through what I've just explained to you. It seemed to fit. It seemed to fit the communist ideology, which said, well, these white guys just stole everything, so now it's our turn. What the hell? If that's how the world works, well, so be it.
Yeah. I tell it in more vulgar terms. I tell it the way a very unpopular man in South Africa, in fact, tells it, and that man is Karel Niehaus. Karel Niehaus was our ambassador for a number of years here in Amsterdam, so I got to know him. And obviously, the ambassador told some things to me. And in later years, I maintained contact with Mr. Niehaus, and in little discussions here and there, he sort of let drop of a couple of things. And part of that was stories such as, and I'm simplifying it now, on day one of CODESA, most of the ANC negotiators arrived in black taxis. By week 2, they sat in the back of the Mercedes-Benz. By week 3, they owned the Mercedes-Benz and had a palace.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see it.
And the payback for that investment in these negotiators was, well, you make sure that we don't become a socialist country. Well, you make sure that we maintain the free market economy, and you make sure that we hold on to property rights. If you give us that, we give you the cash, and they took the cash. The deal was made.
Oh, absolutely. I don't. Yeah. I mean, you could see it happening. I mean, they all got houses and they all got cars, and yes, that's exactly how it worked. Okay, for me, the worst thing was the corruption that went along with maladministration. I mean, I can even deal with the corruption up to a point, but the fact is that this system, instead of them bringing in on board a system which said we're going to raise black people up by teaching them how to do the job. See, I could have lived with that, and that was exactly what my model was. Use an apprenticeship system. Put black people in, like, okay, I said the Boere are really good at running bureaucracies. I mean, look at them. They run this unbelievably brilliant state. They're really good at this stuff. Learn from them. Put black guys in as an apprentice next to those guys. Let them teach you how to do it. It might take you 10 or 15 years to get to the top, but that's okay. When you get there, you'll know how to do it. But that's not what they did. They just gave them the job when the guy couldn't do it, and now you're in the job, and now you apparently must run it when you can't do anything. I mean, it's the worst conceivable model you could have come up with. And that's what produced this complete catastrophic breakdown of everything. Now, the interesting thing is, okay, I can see how English-speaking liberals fooled themselves. I think they literally fooled themselves because they wanted to believe this was all going to turn out wonderfully. That it was all going to turn out okay once you got rid of apartheid. We'd all learn to live together, kumbaya, blah, blah, blah. Now, that was just naive. I think the Americans were naive. But the question is, why? I still ask myself, why did the National Party just fall over like that? I mean, could they not see that this was going to become a disaster? The Boere walked away. They just walked away. In fact, within the ANC, that's what I heard in the beginning. In the beginning, as the negotiations were happening, the ANC guys were baffled by this. They kept saying, "What are these guys doing? They're not even trying. They're not even trying to stop us. They're putting up no resistance. Why? They must be up to something. Something weird is going on here." Because they couldn't understand how the Boere just packed up shop one day and didn't put up any resistance and didn't say, no, that's going to be bad for the country. Now, I cannot believe that all of these, because Okay. The National Party negotiated themselves out of power. They handed the power over. They transferred the levers of power. How could they not see what was happening? Why did they do that? Now, I spoke to a cousin of mine who was a security policeman. I mean, during the war we didn't like each other very much, and then after the war we became good buddies again. And I remember him saying, he explained it this way. He said, the National Party decided, he said, die volk was oorlogsmoeg. It didn't want to fight anymore. Couldn't make them fight. Didn't want to fight. They'd had enough. And de Klerk said, alles moeg. Can't fight anymore. Let's give it up. Now, you see, so in a way, I think everybody, if you look at the negotiation process, it produced something that I think was shockingly bad. But like everybody played a role in this. The ANC screwed up because of what you're saying. They were prepared to sell out in a way. Let's take the second prize and get rich. The English guys were just, I think, very naive. I think the Americans were naive. I don't think the Europeans were that naive. I think they kind of had some inklings that something might be going wrong here. But the Boer just gave up. And so everybody contributed their little piece to the disaster that ultimately happened.
Yeah, my view would be, and I know a lot of people will really be very angry and do become very angry when I say it. I think that the deal that was made at CODESA was based on corruption. It was vulgarly buying up the members of the African National Congress. I think that was the virus that spread through the country and is still eating up the country today. If you look at the incredible corruption and the stealing of money in South Africa, we in the negotiations appealed to the worst instinct of humanity,
and it became a way of life.
Yeah,
and as I say, that is exactly why I left. I literally, I could have got the goodies too. I could have stayed there and become corrupt, because that was on offer. Obviously, I had credibility. I had worked for the struggle.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not prepared to do this. I won't do this. And I went home to my wife and I said, we are leaving. We're going. I don't want to be part of this. This is going to turn out very badly.
Eric, we're out of time. I'd love to invite you back again, if you would permit me that, for more subjects to be explored. I want to leave with a last little question to you. You recently wrote the book Afrikaner Identity, From Anti-Colonial Struggle. I want to read it very carefully so that people really get the title. The Afrikaner Identity, From Anti-Colonial Struggle Through Hegemonic Nationalism to Disempowered Minority. And I put the emphasis on that disempowered minority, because that seems to me is relatively defining where the Afrikaner finds himself today. My question, are we Afrikaners a disempowered minority? Are we experiencing some form of genocide? It's a huge word to use, but I talk more about a cultural genocide. Or
that's right.
Staging 30 years of continuous beating down the Afrikaner. I see that, I feel that amongst my family and friends, the fatigue that Afrikaners have of the finger pointing towards them. So I think the people are tired of that. 30 years continuous finger pointing to the Afrikaner, the Bella Act and what it means for the Afrikaner, the removal, and that's a very important one, because this is how the English said you disempower a nation. The removal of the history of the Afrikaner from our schools. Kill the Boer, kill the farmer. All of this. I guess I then go back to your title, the disempowerment of the minority. To what extent are we disempowered, I guess, could be a question. Do you think we have become disempowered? And I guess the last question, what do we do? Can we lift ourselves up again? Is there a future for the Afrikaner?
I That's why I wrote that last part of the book. I think Afrikaners are disempowered. And of course, it is exactly what Verwoerd said would happen. He got it right. He said, and of course, in NPF and Eric Lowe said it as well, that if you hand over power, if Afrikaners become a minority, a demographic minority within the country, and there's just this sea of black folks who don't like Afrikaners. I think many black folks despise Afrikaners. That's a disaster. I mean, that is absolutely disastrous. In what the whole system, the whole democratic system, is rigged against a minority. What can you do? How do you get out of that? How can you possibly confront this huge machine that is based upon counting heads? So Afrikaners have no political power. Or what political power they have is they can fiddle at the edges, but they can't fundamentally protect themselves anymore. And that's what NPF and Eric Lowe said. You will be as, I think he said, Afrikaners will become as helpless as the Jews were in Germany. And there's some truth in that. You can see it happening. I agree about the cultural genocide thing. In other words, so when people tell me that the killing of the farmers is genocide, I say, no, it's much more complex than that. And I wouldn't use genocide there. But for me, the genocide is the cultural stuff. That is the problem. And it's catastrophic. I mean, you can see every time I go, at one stage, I used to go back to South Africa literally every year to do research. So, and every year I could see the change. You can see it. How Afrikaans just disappeared and disappeared and disappeared. And it wasn't an accident. The ANC did that systematically and deliberately. That is what they want to do. And they've been quite successful. In many ways, the ANC has carried out Milner's policies of anglicizing Afrikaners. And I think that kind of is the future. If this goes on long enough, Afrikaans will probably survive in the Cape, because there's a whole bunch of the Kleurlinge are going to carry on speaking Afrikaans, or enough of them will, that Afrikaans can survive there. But I suspect that within the broader scheme of a unified South Africa, Afrikaans is in big trouble.
Yeah.
And I think white Afrikaner culture is in big trouble. So what do I think is the solution? Well, I kind of go with the Western Cape exit thing. I really do. There was a moment when one of my trips back to South Africa, they put up the ANC built this new monument, this new, whatever it is, their equivalent of the Voortrekker monument, the one on, what's it, near the railway station in Pretoria. And I thought I'd better go and look at this. So I drove there. And when you drive there, you drive past a little primary school. It was that area behind the railway station in Pretoria. It was a very white Afrikaans working area in the 1980s. I remember I was in the army and I used to walk through that area to go to DHQ all the time. And it was where all the railway workers used to live there. And the primary school in that area was called Joppie Fourie School. And I drove past the school on the way to this monument, and it was 100% black, 100% black. And there's no other thing that happened in South Africa that upset me as much as that. I can't tell you how that upset me.
Yeah.
It just said everything about what had happened. Because I thought, none of the teachers and none of the kids in that school know who Joppie Fourie was. It's just words. It means nothing. And I thought, that's what's happening. No one will know. It'll all just disappear. The history will disappear. All that knowledge will just go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that it horrified me. It upset me for days. I just kept having this image of driving past the school and seeing the playground full of, and I'm not saying I didn't want little black kids to have education. That's not what I'm saying. It was just, it was a complete replacement that had happened. And it meant so, and I just thought, that is the future. That is the future. And of course, that's exactly what the Bella Act will do. It will just knock out Afrikaans. So Afrikaners, what the ANC is doing is systematically taking away the Afrikaner capacity to culturally reproduce themselves. If you knock out the universities and the colleges and the schools, well, how do you culturally reproduce yourself then? Yeah. It's all over. Yeah. It's basically all over. And that's why I honestly go for the way. If I thought this could be done, I would go back to South Africa and I would fight for I think the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, and parts of the Eastern Cape should just break away. Yeah. And now it's not a white state. Yeah. It's not a white Afrikaner state. But I think a partnership between Afrikaners and Kleurlinge at least would create a basis where Afrikaner genocide, cultural genocide, would not happen. Yeah. There would be a future country for Afrikaners. And I don't see any other way it can happen.
I want to end this program by saying there's a lot of viewers, people that watch my podcast that accuse me of being woke, accuse me of being a lefty, and all sorts of things because I insist on the need to talk about apartheid and to dissect apartheid. I'm going to go back to say that I think that part of the savior of my people, the Afrikaner, would be for us to go back and to understand how apartheid came about, the real story. I think it's important for us to go back into our history. And I know I heard a speech once by an English intellectual of sorts, I can't remember exactly what, who said that if you want to destroy a nation, the path towards it is you have to kill, I think it was a reference to African tribes for that matter, kill the king, kill the son of the king, kill the culture of the people, kill the language of the people, kill the God of the people, and you've destroyed the people.
There we go.
The Afrikaners' savior lies maybe in that last. It's a deeply Christian nation.
Yeah, I think that's true.
That might be the maintenance of the Afrikaner culture into the future. I fundamentally believe that it is very important for us to go back into history and to analyze what has happened and to try to understand and put apartheid in its proper context. Understanding our history, I think, will make it better for us to explain ourselves and to explain ourselves to the majority of South African, Black South Africans as well. Professor Eric Lowe, thank you very, very much for this discussion. I would love to have you back on the program if you would permit me that, but thank you very, very much for this discussion.
Yep, great. I'll see you again.
Thank you very much.